On an April morning in 1944, air settled over Camp Ruston in northern Louisiana as a small olive-drab convoy halted beside the hospital compound. Longleaf pines stirred above the wire while diesel fumes drifted across the gravel, and the first German women climbed down from the truck, blinking at the pale southern light. Most were Nacrican Felfen and clerical staff from signals units broken during the Allied push through central Italy, taught for months that American captivity meant hunger and medical care withheld as punishment. At the entrance to the low white hospital building, a line of U.S. Army nurses stood in starched uniforms beneath the veranda, brass insignia glinting and faces unreadable. A sight that tightened the prisoners' throats. They braced for barked orders and rough hands, shoulders locking under field gray jackets that still smelled of ship fuel and damp wool. Instead, the first nurse stepped forward with a clipboard and an even voice, asking for names, ailments, and injuries as if this were a routine morning round, while another moved down the line with practiced fingers, checking pulses and wounds without mockery. Inside, the corridors smelled of antiseptic and clean linen, ventilators humming in a steady rhythm, and as bandages were replaced and beds assigned without insult or delay, a small unsettling thought began to spread that here, thousands of miles from home, they might be treated first as patients and only then as prisoners. A possibility the coming days in the camp would slowly test. By the spring of 1944, the appearance of German female auxiliaries in American POW camps was the result of a military collapse that had unfolded far from the quiet woods of northern Louisiana. In Italy, where the Gustav Line cracked under the sustained pressure of Allied offensives, signals, detachments, and communication hubs positioned around Cassino and later along the Arno Line found themselves exposed as frontline formations withdrew in disorder. Many of the women attached to these Necrechtan units had spent the winter sitting at switchboards in requisition farmhouses or cramped stone bunkers, relaying coordinates for artillery batteries, decrypting fragments of intercepted traffic, and attempting to maintain a functioning command structure as ammunition stocks dwindled and radio equipment failed from overuse. Reports from the period show how quickly these re-echelon positions became untenable once the Allied advance accelerated. The very units that had been told they would never see direct combat suddenly found armored columns on their doorsteps. When capture came often in scattered groups, sometimes after brief resistance it collided with years of indoctrination that insisted Allied forces intended to humiliate, starve, or publicly mistreat any German held in their custody, a belief strengthened by speeches circulated within the Wehrmacht that framed American policy as vindictive and racially hostile. Yet the decision to ship these prisoners across the Atlantic followed the established protocols of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which permitted relocation to secure territories when battlefield conditions made local detention impractical. By 1944, the United States had developed a vast POW network of more than 500 facilities, capable of housing over 400,000 Axis soldiers, from enlisted troops to specialists and auxiliaries. Camp Ruston, constructed in 1942 over roughly 770 acres, functioned as a major medical and processing hub in the Deep South, complete with hospital wards, dental offices, sanitation complexes, and its own staffed infirmary prepared to treat long-term cases. For the women who arrived there, the transition from ruined Italian towns to the ordered geometry of an American camp represented not just physical relocation, but a rupture in expectation. The scale, cleanliness, and predictability of Ruston contradicted everything they had been led to believe about Allied detention, setting the stage for their first encounters with a system whose routines and humanitarian standards belonged to a world profoundly different from the collapsing right behind them. By the time the German auxiliaries passed through Ruston's gates, the hospital complex inside the camp had already earned a reputation among American inspectors as one of the most complete medical facilities in the region. Built not as an improvised wartime shelter, but as a fully standardized institution of the U.S. Army Medical Department. Its H-shaped layout to long patient wings, joined by a central administrative spine mirrored blueprints used across dozens of stateside installations, allowing doctors, nurses, and orderlies to move efficiently between wards while keeping infectious cases isolated when necessary. Steam pipes beneath the flooring kept the interiors warm during Louisiana's damp winters, and screened windows protected patients from the heavy onslaught of mosquitoes and midges that swarmed the surrounding pine forests each summer. Inside, rows of metal-framed beds stood evenly spaced beneath whitewashed ceilings, each one fitted with muslin sheets and wool blankets that seemed impossibly clean to women whose only medical experience during the Italia campaign had involved smoky casualty stations, overworked medics, and chronic shortages of even basic bandages. The equipment within Ruston's small medical empire reflected the purported industrial strength of the nation that operated it. Autoclaves hissed in the sterilization rooms. X-ray units flickered with a reliability rare in European field hospitals. Trays of surgical instruments shone with the fine machining of factories that had shifted into war production without ever being bombed. By 1944, the U.S. military was issuing millions of dressings and penicillin vials each month. And at Ruston, these supplies moved through the wards with quiet regularity. The German women watched with disbelief as infections were treated immediately rather than left to worsen, as dental complaints received proper attention, and as ophthalmic cases were treated with the same seriousness as battlefield wounds. Temperature rounds were conducted at fixed intervals. Recovery charts were updated with meticulous handwriting, and the nurses, many trained in major stateside hospitals, maintained a neutral professionalism, meant to signal consistency rather than favoritism. 4. Prisoners accustomed to the brutal arithmetic of scarcity and triage. This environment seemed almost unreal. What they encountered inside Ruston was not kindness in the sentimental sense, but procedure, backed by a logistical system that treated adherence to the Geneva Convention's paragraph 10 as an operational mandate. That technical orderliness laid the foundation for every human interaction that followed, quietly preparing the ground for the first battlefield casualties who would soon enter these corridors and challenge the women's expectations even further. The first German women admitted to Camp Ruston's hospital arrived in the warm weeks of May and June 1944, still bearing the physical imprint of a front that had collapsed too quickly for proper evacuation. Their injuries traced the path of the retreat through Atoll shrapnel embedded near ribs, from 105 mm and 155 mm fragmentation shells that had burst over field telephone posts outside casino, burns along forearms where generator sheds had caught fire after a night raid by medium bombers, deep bruising from hurried withdrawals through collapsing positions where debris struck faster than medics could intervene. By the time these women reached the American interior, they were weary from the long passage aboard converted troops, their German-issued dressings stiff with dried blood, iodine residue, and dust from the Arno Valley. They expected that their arrival in the ward would be met with suspicion or cold detachment, conditioned as they were to believe that capturing Powers withheld resources from enemy wounded. Instead, the nurses who stepped to their bedsides carried the quiet assurance of routine. Without haste, but with unmistakable skill, they loosened the makeshift field bandages, cutting away layers of coarse gauze that had been applied under battlefield pressure. Warm saline softened the edges of wounds that had not been properly cleaned since Italy, and the nurses narrated their movements in calm voices, English words that many of the prisoners could not fully translate yet instinctively recognized as patient, steady, and procedural. Fresh U.S. dressings were applied with adhesive tape unfamiliar to German auxiliaries, and when sulfa powder, still a scarce commodity in the Reich, was sprinkled gently over inflamed tissue, the shock registered visibly in the patient's expressions. Even routine comforts unsettled them, pillows adjusted without being requested, pulses checked at regular intervals, and meal trays brought with full hospital portions rather than the reduced rations they assumed would mark them as enemies. These early cases spread quickly through the compound, carried by women who whispered that their wounds had been treated not with hostility but with professional obligation. In time, these accounts formed the first layer of understanding that the American medical staff operated under a codified ethic rather than personal sentiment, a realization that would influence how every subsequent group of prisoners interpreted the puzzling consistency of life inside Ruston's quiet hospital corridors. By late summer 1944, as the humid Louisiana air settled heavy over Camp Ruston and new contingents of captured auxiliaries arrived with respiratory infections, malnutrition, or lingering battlefield injuries, a parallel current of information began moving quietly through the camp. The earliest patients, those treated in May and June, had already whispered their astonishment to others, and these murmurs found their way into the routine interviews conducted by U.S. Army intelligence officers. What began as small remarks tucked into interrogation summaries soon formed a consistent pattern that surprised even the analysts compiling them. Women who had once worked in communication posts near Cassino or Florence described the nurses as unnecessary, gentle, a phrase repeated often enough that translators rendered it almost verbatim in the typed memos forwarded to military intelligence branches. To the officers reviewing these reports, the wording revealed more than simple gratitude. It exposed how thoroughly German command briefings had shaped expectations of American medical cruelty. Cross-checks with International Committee of the Red Cross documentation confirmed that the prisoners' accounts aligned with the Geneva Conventions. Paragraph 10, requirements equal care, regardless of nationality. Yet for the women inside Ruston, conformity to those rules felt almost destabilizing. They spoke of small but disarming gestures, a nurse lifting a blanket edge to check for chills, another offering a warm compress during a fever spike, or the quiet reassurance given when a patient struggled to swallow rationed broth. These moments contradicted the indoctrination they had carried for years, and U.S. intelligence officers noted that such reactions hinted at subtle shifts in morale and ideological certainty. The reports also revealed a second tension. While some auxiliaries admitted that the treatment challenged what the Reich had taught them, they often did so hesitantly, wary of how fellow prisoners, especially those more doctrinaire or embittered, might interpret cooperation, or even mild praise of American procedures. Despite censorship, fragments of these impressions slipped into letters routed through Red Cross channels, reaching Germany in diluted but unmistakable form and complicating the Reich's attempts to maintain unwavering belief in Allied brutality. As these observations accumulated, American analysts began to recognize that the women's reactions were not isolated, but part of a wider psychological shift taking shape within the camp. And as Rustin's medical operations expanded to accommodate rising numbers of wounded and ill prisoners, the clash between expectation and reality only sharpened, leading naturally into the deeper logistical systems that sustained the hospital's smooth and predictable functioning. By autumn 1944, the smooth efficiency of Camp Rustin's hospital had become inseparable from the industrial engine that powered it, an engine whose scale stunned every newly arrived German prisoner who entered the ward. The United States, deep into its third year of full wartime mobilization, had constructed a logistical network capable of delivering medical supplies with a regularity that European armies, not least a Reich, already strained by Allied bombing, could no longer imagine. Each week, long-bed military trucks and medical trains rolled in from depots in Shreveport and New Orleans, offloading crates stamped with Army Medical Department markings. Inside were cartons of sulfoname packets, stacks of cotton rolls, surgical gloves sealed in waxed paper, and the increasingly common penicillin vials that American factories were now producing by the millions. For women accustomed to aid stations where bandages were washed and reused until they nearly dissolved, the sight of entire shelves filled with identical, untouched supplies bordered on the surreal. Nurses treated this abundance not as luxury but as protocol. Before each shift, they drew from orderly cabinets where everything had a designated place, preparing sterilized trays, fresh dressings, and morphine ampules without having to ration or improvise. Autoclaves ran in continuous cycles, the hiss of steam becoming part of the ward's daily rhythm. Even the hospital kitchen, connected to the medical wing by a short, covered walkway, reflected the same industrial predictability. Its standardized menus pushed particularly high-protein meals designed to rebuild weakened bodies, thick soups, boiled meats, fortified milk, and vitamin supplements. German auxiliaries who had survived the shortages of the Italian front stared in disbelief at the portions placed before them, unable to reconcile these meals with the starvation warnings they had been fed before capture. Quartermaster, chorus trucks added to this sense of order, delivering blankets, soap, laundry supplies, and replacement linens with clockwork precision. To the prisoners, the regularity of these shipments revealed something profound, but their care was not an exception granted out of sentiment but a structural guarantee built into a system designed for scale. And as the winter of 1944 approached, bringing respiratory illnesses and rising admissions across the camp, this logistical backbone would prove essential in sustaining the quality of treatment. During the cold months of early 1945, when the hospital faced its most demanding cases yet, by the first cold fronts of December 1944, the rhythm of Camp Rustin's hospital shifted as waves of respiratory illness moved through the fewer German women housed in the compound. Louisiana's winter, mild by regional standards yet marked by abrupt swings between damp chill and midday warmth, proved especially hard on prisoners, whose bodies were still weakened from months of malnutrition, long transport, and camp work details. Bronchitis, influenza, and stubborn fevers filled the ward's admission logs. Many of the women arrived, bracing themselves for the bare minimum care they believed wartime scarcity would impose on enemy patients. Instead, the nurses responded by expanding their rounds, carrying thermometers, compressed cloths, and stethoscopes from bed to bed, with a steadiness that defied the women's expectations. During coughing fits, nurses raised bed frames to ease breathing, tucked blankets under shivering shoulders, and pressed warm compresses gently against sore ribs. When sulfa tablets were issued to fight infection, and cough elixirs were measured into enamel cups, the prisoners watched the precision of each action as if waiting for the moment the courtesy would disappear. It never did. Those with high fevers or worsening symptoms were moved into small isolation rooms along the ward's side corridor, spaces fitted with circulating fans and disinfectant trays. The transfer itself left many women speechless, not because of the isolation, but because of the care with which the nurses guided them down the hallway, steadying elbows, preventing drafts, and monitoring breathing as they settled into new beds. Cold snaps deepened the sense of disbelief. Extra blankets appeared at the foot of beds without being requested, and when night temperatures dropped, nurses returned with warm broth and calming words, rather than reprimands for restlessness. The turning point for many came during long, hacking coughing spells when nurses remained at their sides, offering reassurance in the soft, measured tone of someone trained to comfort rather than discipline. These moments echoed quickly across the camp, carried in quiet conversations at morning roll call or whispered outside barracks. By early spring 1945, the pattern had become unmistakable. The Americans treated prisoner health as a matter of procedure, not sentiment. And as the women recovered, their perceptions shifted accordingly. The nurses who had once seemed like distant adversaries now appeared as professionals, shaped by a system whose values predictability, order and duty had little to do with the fear-laden propaganda the prisoners had been taught to trust. It was this growing recognition that would guide the next stage of their psychological transformation as the war's final months unfolded by April 1945. As azalea blooms began appearing beyond the camp fences and the war's final months unfolded across a collapsing Europe, the psychological strain inside Camp Ruston's hospital no longer stemmed primarily from illness. Instead, it came from the widening gap between what the German female auxiliaries had been taught to expect and what they encountered each day within the ward's quiet, orderly halls. Many had arrived conditioned by years of propaganda that depicted American forces as vindictive and indifferent to enemy suffering. Yet weeks of steady care chipped away at these convictions with an almost disarming subtlety. The nurses moving through their duties, with the same calm precision, regardless of nationality, became, without intending to, the most persistent contradiction the women had ever faced. A pillow adjusted for comfort, a measured dose of aspirin for a headache, or a brief word of reassurance during a fever spike. All carried far greater weight than the gestures themselves suggested. As the women recovered enough to sit up in bed or walk the corridor, conversations grew more introspective. In the low evening light, when the ward settled into a hush broken only by the distant hum of ventilators, some auxiliaries whispered that their greatest discomfort now came from the realization that their assumptions about the enemy were dissolving. Others admitted they no longer knew what to believe. The humanitarian consistency they witnessed at Ruston, sterile instruments prepared without hesitation, medical charts updated without regard to ideology, and the absence of political scrutiny over who deserved care stood in sharp contrast to the shortages and rising fear that had defined German hospitals during the Reich's final years. A few women confessed to feelings of guilt, sensing that they were receiving a level of attention they had never imagined possible while Germany endured bombing raids and medical scarcity. Others felt a strange sense of safety that seemed almost disloyal, as if accepting comfort were a betrayal of the world they had left behind. These internal fractures marked more than private uncertainty. They signaled the beginning of a deeper strategic understanding that would influence how the prisoners interpreted the war's trajectory. The dissonance created by kindness and the realization that American strength rested not just on weaponry but on systems, procedures, and a commitment to stability laid the groundwork for the broader reassessments that would follow as news of Germany's imminent collapse reached the Louisiana interior. By mid-1945, as scattered news of Allied breakthroughs filtered into Camp Ruston through Red Cross bulletins, censored postcards, and the guarded matter-of-fact tone of American guards, the German female prisoners began to reinterpret their hospital experiences in a far broader strategic light. What had first seemed like isolated acts of medical professionalism now appeared to them as evidence of a national system, whose strength ran far deeper than battlefield victories alone. The steady availability of penicillin, the predictable arrival of medical shipments, and the presence of fully trained nurses tending even minor ailments, revealed a logistical capacity that none of the women had ever imagined the United States possessed. They understood, many for the first time, that the country treating them with such procedural care was simultaneously supplying entire armies across Europe and the Pacific, a realization that made the shortages and panic afflicting German cities feel even more distant and irretrievable. Inside the ward, the nurses continued their routines unchanged, unaware that their precision carried tactical significance in the eyes of their patients. To the auxiliaries, each fresh dressing, each protein-rich meal, and each unhurried temperature check signaled a stability that no propaganda could disguise. The contrast with Germany's collapsing infrastructure was stark. Many remembered their final months in Italian hospitals, where dressings were reused until they frayed and where medical decisions were shaped by scarcity rather than protocol. Here, by contrast, abundance was mundane. Even the smallest gesture, adjusting a bed frame or offering vitamins, seemed to confirm what the prisoners were piecing together from fragmentary news. The United States was fighting a global war without straining the systems that supported it. Some women admitted quietly, often only to one trusted friend, that the medical care they received had dissolved the last remnants of belief in official claims that Allied societies were weakened, immoral, or nearing economic exhaustion. Others recognized that what they witnessed at Ruston amounted to a human-scale demonstration of Allied power, one more persuasive than any interrogation or leaflet. The nurses did not craft propaganda. They simply enacted a structure that worked. And it was that structure, the seamless blend of ethics, logistics, and competence, that revealed to the prisoners how decisively the war's momentum had shifted. This emerging strategic awareness reshaped the atmosphere within the hospital as Germany's surrender approached. preparing the women for a final phase in which questions of identity, responsibility, and post-war futures would cross the threshold of Ruston's orderly corridors and demand answers none of them had been trained to confront. By the summer of 1945, Camp Ruston's hospital, so steady through the previous year of admissions, found itself tested in ways that revealed both the strengths and the limits of the system the German women had come to admire. The war in Europe had ended in May, triggering a cascade of logistical shifts across the U.S. military. Troop movements redirected supplies. Demobilization schedules pulled experienced personnel back to stateside posts, and the camp population fluctuated as some prisoners were transferred for labor duties while others awaited repatriation. In July, an influenza wave swept through several barracks and reached the hospital in concentrated bursts, filling beds and pushing the staff to the edge of their capacity. Nurses adjusted by splitting sleep rotations into smaller intervals, and enlisted medical orderlies, often young Americans with minimal training, were brought in to maintain sanitation cycles and distribute warm fluids. Yet, even in this moment of strain, the German women noticed that the system bent without breaking. Penicillin, whose wartime supply had grown dramatically, was now rationed more deliberately as global production lines transitioned from combat to peacetime priorities. The prisoners saw the change in how carefully nurses logged each vial and verified dosages, but the medication remained available for serious infections. Less urgent ailments were treated with sulfonamides or supportive care, and the triage process, though brisk, remained organized. Standardized medical charts became central to this adaptation, helping staff track fevers, recovery times, and isolation needs without missing a patient during the busiest hours. Through it all, the nurses' calm tone prevented panic, their professionalism serving as continuity even when conditions grew chaotic. Cultural misunderstandings surfaced more frequently during this period. Some German women flinched during examinations due to differing expectations of modesty, while others expressed confusion about American dietary substitutions introduced during ration adjustments. Each time, the nurses addressed the concerns with matter-of-fact clarity rather than irritation, reinforcing the sense that care was rooted in procedure, not personal judgment. As the camp administration prepared for repatriation, new requirements emerged. Medical clearances, updated health records, and vaccination checks before transport lists were finalized. These administrative layers altered the hospital's daily rhythm, yet the transition revealed the resilience of the system the women had observed for months. Even under pressure, the structure functioned, and by the time the first groups prepared to leave Ruston, many of the German auxiliaries realized that their months in the ward were no longer a temporary suspension of wartime reality but an experience that would shape how they understood the world. They were about to return to a world in ruins, where order and care would feel strikingly unfamiliar. By the opening months of 1946, as the last winter frosts settled over northern Louisiana, Camp Ruston's era as a major POW center drew to a quiet close. For the German women who had spent weeks or months in its hospital, the approaching repatriation brought emotions more complicated than any of them had anticipated when they first stepped off the convoy trucks nearly 2 years earlier. Many returned to the medical ward for final clearance examinations, routine checks of lungs, pulse, weight, and any lingering infections. Yet the atmosphere carried a different weight now. The nurses who moved from bed to bed were no longer abstract representatives of an enemy nation, but familiar figures, whose calm consistency had anchored the women through illness, fear, and ideological unraveling. What had once felt like an unsettling contradiction to German propaganda had, over time, become one of the few sources of stability they trusted. Some auxiliaries admitted quietly, usually as they waited in line for records to be updated, that the Ruston Hospital had been the first place in years where they felt genuinely safe. After the chaos of Italy's collapsing fronts, the hunger of late-war rationing, and the physical strain of transport across the Atlantic, the ward's orderliness, its warm blankets, scheduled meals, and unchanging routines had provided a sense of normalcy they scarcely recognized as comfort until it was about to disappear. Others confessed to a growing dread about what awaited them in Germany: bombed cities, missing relatives, and medical systems overwhelmed by the war's aftermath. In that light, their experiences at Ruston felt not just humane but transformative. The nurses, aware that these were the final interactions they would ever have with the prisoners, maintained their professionalism but allowed subtle warmth to enter their farewells. A brief wish for safe travel, a reminder to rest during the long journey, or a quiet acknowledgement of recovery often left the women unexpectedly emotional. Post-war interviews preserved by the Red Cross and scattered veterans' archives later showed that many former Ruston patients credited the care they received with altering their understanding of the United States and, in some cases, with enabling them to survive the hunger and disruption that marked Europe's immediate post-war years. For military historians, Ruston became a case study in how strict adherence to humanitarian standards could ripple far beyond the boundaries of a camp. What unfolded in its wards demonstrated that gestures made in clinical settings, steady voices, clean bandages, unhurried care, could leave impressions powerful enough to outlast the conflict itself. And as the women boarded the convoys that would carry them eastward toward a shattered homeland, they carried those memories with them, bringing the narrative full circle toward the documentary's closing reflection on where this profound transformation first began. On that humid April morning in 1944, when the convoy braked beside the hospital compound and the German auxiliaries first stepped into the thick Louisiana air, every expectation they carried was shaped by fear. They believed they were entering a place defined by hostility, a final descent into the cruelty they had been warned to expect. Yet the moment a nurse moved toward a feverish young auxiliary, steadying her elbow as she swayed, guiding her gently toward a waiting bed, adjusting the blanket with practiced care, marked the first crack in that imagined terror. At the time, it seemed only a fleeting gesture amid the confusion of arrival. But as the years passed and the women rebuilt their lives in a devastated Germany, many came to realize that this quiet moment had become the defining image of their captivity. What unfolded in Ruston's hospital weren't the clean bandages applied. Without hesitation, the warm broth offered during long nights of coughing, the calm voices that cut through fear grew in memory to eclipse the ruined landscapes and collapsing commands they had left behind. These small, repeated acts carried a meaning the women could not fully understand at the time, that individual compassion could outlast ideology, and that care offered without judgment could reshape not just wounds, but WORLDVIEWS. As the story closes, the lingering image is not of barbed wire or guarded gates, but of the steady rhythm inside that ward where nurses worked without ceremony, unaware that their routines would follow the prisoners across an ocean and into the decades that followed. In the memory of a hand at the bedside, the arc that began in dread finds its quiet resolution in recognition, enduring reminder of how humanity can surface even in the harshest of wars.